So I'm Schwend, water planner with DNRC, and I work in the Upper Missouri Basin. And I think I'm going to do a little bit of adaptive presentation after hearing Jeff's, lead in and what Carrie has to say and what Pat has to say. And my piece is being a planner. And so a planner is someone who has to really think about how do we bring the legal constraints, the physical constraints, the people and the ecology that are here that are all relying on the water. How do we pull that all together and think about planning for our water future? And I think that it's a pretty important consideration and one that maybe doesn't get as much, people often think, oh, planning, I don't know if I really want to be planning for that, but I think that it's something that makes sense for all of us. I secretly love numbers, and even though I'm a water planner, I often think about water planning kind of like budgeting. It's our water budget, right? We've all just heard that we don't really have enough water. We don't legally have more water available. Climate change is going to have an impact on when that water is available for us and how we get that water and how we take care of it. So if you think about like a family budget, how do you, if you sat down and said, okay, family, here's our budget for the year. We're not going to get any more. We don't know exactly when it's coming, but we have to meet some certain demands ahead of time, right? So if you think about it in terms of money or water or whatever it is, you want to be thinking about how do you do that so that you can be, when you have flush times, times of high water, runoff, snowmelt, since we're a snowmelt-driven system, where can we set that water aside? And I think Pat's presentation really talks to us about how do we use our natural system for setting that water aside or thinking of it as our savings account. So we're slowing the water down in the headwaters, and you have that for a little bit longer because once it goes downstream, it's downstream, and it's not available for this community to use that water anymore. So it doesn't mean that you have to use all of it, but it means that you need to be thinking about it wisely and you need to be thinking about the timing. So I'm going, let's see, was this just a, there we go. Just quickly, when we were talking about basins, thinking about Montana and some of the challenges we have with planning, these are watershed boundaries in Montana, and we are broken up. We have 4 planners that work for DNRC, one in the Clark Fork, I'm in the Upper Missouri, the Lower Missouri, and the Yellowstone. And it's really difficult to plan for water because hydrologic basins don't follow our typical political jurisdictions. So sometimes it gets a little bit challenging to be working across those divides. I wanted to give you just a quick background because the topic was community drought planning, and I just wanted to give you a background on sort of what has happened here in the Upper Missouri that's of interest. In 2014, President Obama came out with this climate action plan, and as part of that, he said, we want to bring federal partners together and talk about how we can bring these resources together and really make a difference on the ground with community-based planning. We were fortunate enough that at the Western Governors Association, some powers that be said we should be doing that in Montana as a demonstration project. So they selected the Upper Missouri. They selected a larger area, but we decided to focus in on this Upper Missouri Basin and the 8 watersheds that are within the area that flows to the 3 forks of the Missouri. Thinking that we're at the very top, we want to start at the top. These are mostly snowpack-driven, mountainous regions, pretty rural agriculture, still a lot of open spaces, still a lot of opportunity for us to demonstrate how we can do this here. And I feel pretty lucky because we've had some really great partnerships, which I may not have said at the beginning, bringing all the federal partners in. But when they decided to do that in Montana, we said really important here in Montana, we start from the ground up. We feel it's really important to be doing this from the community level rather than the federal partners coming in and telling us how we might do that, because we believe that we really have the wisdom and the leadership. And I look around this room and I think this is a great demonstration of really people coming together and thinking about how do we do that. And we wanted to make sure that we were really engaging the communities. We were bringing all these resources in. I'd like to talk about it sort of like a watershed basin itself. How do we put our arms out, capture these federal and state resources, sort of put them into the blender, and then deliver them across a larger landscape? And do that in a way that's really working with the communities and is it is resulting in projects that are on the ground that build resilience. Resilience is kind of a catchword. And it was really talking about drought. So we've had over the last couple of years, I've been working specifically with the watershed groups, Gallatin River Task Force and the other groups that are in the basin, and trying to figure out how do we do this and what kinds of resources do they need. So we brought, this was just a small smattering. We had a meeting in Dillon last year with about 80 participants of the federal and state and local folks. And we set out with a work plan. And there were several goals, but the one that I want to focus on for you guys is, and I thought it was great that it really dawned on everyone, how do we really develop this local and regional capacity to plan for drought? You guys are sitting in this room, we're talking about water quality and water supply and wastewater. When we talk about drought, even though I think there are lots of people who have in their mind what drought means, to me it's water planning, because drought is basically a water shortage. And whether that's climatically induced or it's ecological or it's growth driven, it just means that we don't have enough water to meet all of our water needs. And I mean collectively all of our water needs. So we were talking about how do we do that and how can we bring these capacities to the local groups. From that, we realized, and we worked with the National Drought Mitigation Center out of Nebraska and folks in NOAA in Denver, and they've been doing some drought planning. But it was kind of this aha moment for me when everybody keeps talking about drought planning that I'll get to in just a moment. But one of the things that we decided to do was to really develop a class or a course, because prior to this, we didn't, kind of crazy, even though I'm a planner for the state, we didn't really have a system for how you would develop a drought plan. We really only had a few groups in the state that have a drought plan, that have a drought response plan, but to me it doesn't really capture everything. And so we said, let's think about this a little more holistically. If we're planning for drought, or if it's really water planning, how do we do that? So we created a hybrid version that's based on the Bureau of Reclamation Planning and some other pieces, and delivered this webinar, this online course, of which Emily, Casey, and Kristen were very active. So in the plan, we feel like there's some really key elements that we wanted to cover, and I'm thinking about this, and I'm thinking about how we're doing this here. Community drought planning. How are you identifying the key stakeholders? I think the key stakeholders are in this room. I think you guys are all here. And then thinking about other planning efforts that are going on and how do we integrate that. We also want to talk about, we want everyone to have a basic understanding of water and climate and the history and what does water supply mean for this community. And I think we're getting a lot of that today as well. So we're 2 out of 5 for the moment. And then the next step, and this is where you really get into the serious planning, is thinking about impacts and vulnerability assessments. Pat talked a lot about impacts and the vulnerabilities of fish and how much water do they need. I would say that we also need to do that for the human community, and you need to do that for the recreational community, and you need to do that for the other water use sectors that are important for your community planning here. And thinking about those impacts and what does it mean and what do we do if we don't have enough water. Typically, drought planning is really focused on your response plan. It's an emergency action. What happens when you have a crisis? When something happens, Ron, and you don't have enough water, in some water supply, if you've exceeded your demands, what are you guys going to do? If there's an earthquake or something happens to your water supply, that's your response, that's your immediate plan. Those are really important, but to me, they're not as critical as your long-term mitigation strategies. And again, that's what Pat's talking about, is how do we think about capturing as much water in our system as we legally can, is legally available, and use our natural system to gather that water and think about conservation and all the methods that we can use to ensure that you have enough water for this community. Mitigation strategies is the long term. So our plan right now is we're working with each of these watersheds. Each of them are doing their own sort of similarly based drought or water supply planning in the individual watersheds. And then we are going to roll all that up into a headwaters basin plan. Stay tuned for that. That's going to be something that's going to be covering the whole area. And basically outcomes where we hope to go with that, and Karen's given me the sign. So we'll call that good. I was close. All right. Okay, thanks.